Seth Andrew is the Senior Advisor to the Chief Technology Officer at the White House Office of Science and Technology, and he's also the founder of Democracy Prep Public Schools. The Democracy Prep Public Schools are a network of 15 public charter schools in New York and in Washington, D.C., and under Andrew's leadership, the Democracy Prep Charter School was the #1 middle school in all of New York City. He has also served as senior advisor to Secretary Arne Duncan and superintendent in residence at the U.S. Department of Education with a focus on education technology. So please let us welcome Seth Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it is good to be home. I'm going to simultaneously start while putting in a thumb drive because this switch off requires a little tech work, as you all know. But first of all, thank you everyone for being part of this. I am born and raised in Upper Manhattan. My parents both worked in New York nonprofits for their entire careers, including God of Riverside and New York Presbyterian, and so I feel very at home in this crowd, and I'm glad to come up for DC for the day. So much so that I was willing to leave the White House and a bill signing. The president today is signing the Every Student Succeeds Act that was approved by the conference committee to replace the No Child Left Behind Act yesterday. And so it's a really momentous day in education policy. But I wanted to be among my nonprofit tech brethren. So it is good to see you all, and I'm glad that you came out today on this beautiful day in New York. So one of the things that I just want to do to add a little bit to the bio that they kindly printed in the brochure is that part of being a nonprofit tech leader and a nonprofit leader in general is understanding how to iterate, is understanding how to grow and to progress and to learn and to move your organization, move your clients along as the world changes. And even as the panel was talking about the transformation in access to technology and to cell phones and to text, it's a different world than 5 years, than 10 years ago. And so we all have to redouble our efforts to really follow the path of technology and incorporate it into our work in meaningful and profound ways. And the president is a great example of that. The president, as you know, started out as a community organizer. He started out in nonprofits in Chicago and built his work in the political sphere starting in nonprofits. And what he realized is that communication and those interpersonal one-on-one relationships that he was building on the south side of Chicago were part of what made him as a good community organizer, built his leadership skills and otherwise. But by the time he began to run for president, the world had changed. And he was able to take that technology in 2007, 2008, as he built his campaign, to be the tool that took him into office and into the presidency. And it was a remarkable transformation to see that work of going door to door and building personal relationships to using technology to build millions of personal relationships on a national scale, the way that the president did as no other. And so he's a great example for the work that we do in the nonprofit tech space. One of the things that he found when he came into office in 2008 is that let me pause there and ask a quick question. How many of your nonprofits have a chief technology officer or a leader of technology? Right? It should be, I think some people are lazy, it should be most of you. When the President of the United States of America came into office, there was no chief technology officer of the United States of America. So we had a $1 trillion enterprise with no CTO. We had all of the balkanized technology, all of the balkanized intermediaries working on different systems and different platforms across government, and there was no one there who was both the coordinator and the evangelist for the work. And so I am privileged to work in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the Executive Office of the President with the U.S. Chief Technology Officer, Megan Smith. And Megan is an inspiration. If you haven't read about her or seen some of her work, I encourage you to sort of Google her and get a little bit more knowledge about her, because she is the third U.S. CTO. And she came in from Google running Google X, a company that really did moonshots, that thought a lot about how do we take what we're doing today and look way into the future to transform what's possible. And Megan has brought that moonshot thinking, that moonshot spirit to the White House, to senior staff meetings in the morning with the president and the chief of staff, to really think about what those moonshots can be and to take our country and our technology into the next generation. So the first priority that the president had when he came into office in many ways was to create a digital open government, the most open government in the history of America. And the first thing he had to do to make that possible was to welcome what Megan calls TQ into government. So we have in the White House, we have in the Domestic Policy Council, the National Economic Council, the National Security Council, a tremendous amount of IQ, really smart people. I mean, I am blown away every day by the incredible caliber of people that are leading our nation. It's truly humbling. There are a number of people, though maybe not quite as many, with a fair amount of EQ that have those interpersonal relationships, that understand how to read people and how to communicate effectively. And what was missing at the table when we came into office was TQ. The people that actually understood technology, and not just as users, but as builders, as creators. And so the president created on his first day in office the position of Chief Technology Officer of the United States. And that was what set in motion a series of plays to bring technical talent into government, to be able to provide a more responsive government for not only government services, but nonprofit supports, business supports, et cetera, to build the technology tools and the policy frameworks with technologists at the table. Historically, that just wasn't the case, that the policymakers would sit at a table, decide what was going to happen, and then contract it out to a vendor who would run the tech. And so the decisions weren't being made with that technology at the table that was going to make a better product, a better tool, a better service for the clients that we served, in this case, the American people. So what we had to do is update the playbook to what we call now 3.0 methodology. And the 3.0 methodology, in 1.0, you really you started to use tech, and 2.0 and sort of computers and sort of capturing a little bit of data. In 2.0, it was really about push data. So we were pushing out emails to communicate. And 3.0 is really about a back and forth with the American people, about using tools like the We the People petition tool, which has more traffic than whitehouse.gov by a factor of 5. It's had more than 30 million people sign on as unique users to sign a petition to tell the government what to do. And we've committed to responding to all of those petitions that get more than 100,000 signatures. So it becomes a back and forth conversation, a 3.0 conversation, instead of just a tool where we use to message out to people. And what Megan talks about, and what I encourage all you to do, to think about as well in your work as nonprofit and nonprofit tech leaders, is to update your playbooks and to get current. And so the playbook that Megan at Google and other places use, and that we use in the team CTO, is the first thing is to understand and define and explore the problem. And so in the first panel, it was really great because we were asking questions about what stack and what service, and should we use a tool that is all encompassing or different ones. And the right question is not that. The right question is, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? And working really hard to define that problem. Once you do, very often there are already people and organizations who are solving that problem out there. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel, especially as generally under-resourced nonprofit sector. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to build everything. We have to find the people and the tools and then iterate on those tools using those interconnections. And so very often there may be a comparable nonprofit in another city. There may be a nonprofit right here in New York that you can connect with that has a tool where you can share tools and share resources. So when I ran one of my nonprofits, we shared a back-end tool for student data tracking with a number of other schools. And so not only did it bring down our costs, but we were also able to get comparative data in real time with schools that had similar populations. And we were able to get a better feedback by interconnecting and collaborating with fellow partners who had similar missions. And then once we iterated on those models and built new tools, then we had to do the most important thing, which is what the president did when he both was running for office and came into office, was he changed the culture. He changed the culture about what it was like to be a technologist in government. And so we have a policy agenda in Team CTO, but what I wanted to make sure that I focused on first for us today was to really talk about the power of changing your organizational culture. And so many of you have been around for years. I said my mom worked at Goddard Riverside, and I heard somebody was here from Goddard Riverside earlier. This is an organization that has decades of history in New York. And so part of the challenge with any organization, institution with decades of history is to change the culture to embrace technology and where its clients and its staff really are. And so when the president brought Megan and our team in to really change the culture, we got a whole new perspective. Coverage that, on Wired Magazine and Fast Company, in places that the United States government wasn't really thought of as like the next best tech startup. But now in our office, we have the former general counsel of Twitter. We have a head of product at Facebook. We have somebody who founded Medium. We have a team member who was like number 4 or 5 at LinkedIn. I mean, people who are some of the most talented technical builders and thinkers in the country, helping to run the policy conversation at the White House in addition to the technical agenda that we have. And so once we started to build that capacity, we had to expand it from a central group. And so one of the things that happened is that we brought in entrepreneurs in residence. And this is something that nonprofits don't do anywhere near enough. People that come into an organization, not as consultants, but really as internal parts of the organization, to think about what are the entrepreneurial opportunities within this organization to take on a new line of business, a new client service, a new way of thinking, a new partnership, a new merger, whatever those things might be. And the entrepreneurs in residence were called the Presidential Innovation Fellows. And so they started spreading across federal government to build a new tech culture in agencies like the Department of Ed, where I worked at one point, the Department of Labor, all over federal government. From there, they created a team called 18F. 18F is a group of builders. So these are technologists who actually build open source government tools for other government agencies. So now there's more than 200 people on the 18F team who are working to build these tools that are available to multiple agencies. So you don't have to build it once through a contract. You actually get to build it through the 18F team and then share it with multiple agencies across the government. And then the last team that was built is one that I want to just talk to you a little bit about, because you may have heard about something. It's the United States Digital Service Team. And the United States Digital Service Team are the firefighters. These are folks who help to solve the existing problems in organizations. And they were really born out of the crisis that came through healthcare.gov. And as you no doubt know, the Affordable Care Act was passed and signed by the president, and it was one of his clear legacy items, bringing healthcare to the American people in a way that was thought impossible just a few years ago. And it has enrolled millions and millions of new folks in healthcare because of the law and the work that we did. And it almost failed. The entire legislation, the entire effort, the entire millions, 15 million, I think right now, new Americans having healthcare, it almost failed because of a website. It almost failed because of a bad website. Imagine all of the missions in your organizations today almost failing because of a website on this scale. And so what happened at that moment is the president had his team come in and they said, we need to get a SWAT team on this, a firefighting team on this to fix it fast. They brought in, Todd Park was the chief technology officer at the time. He brought in some of the Presidential Innovation Fellows, some other tech sector folks to come in and to solve this problem. And what had been built as I think it was around $800 million all in web system that was incredibly complex, had a really hard task to do by contractors, multiple contractors and subcontractors pointing fingers at one another. Todd and his team were able to come in and really help to transform that and make the site work again. And when they were all done, they basically said, we could have built this site for 1/10 the cost and a great deal more productive and more effective had we had the technology talent at the beginning, thinking this through at the beginning. So back to my challenge to you as nonprofit tech leaders, bring the technical talent to you into your organizations early so that you're not just having to purchase and get vendor services, but you actually have people in your organizational senior leadership team thinking deeply about technology. And what that's done is allowed us to come up with these blueprints. So you can get all of these at whitehouse.gov. You can find U.S. Digital Service, 18F, the Presidential Innovation Fellows. They're always recruiting. So if you know somebody who wants to come and serve government, we don't think of this as a lifetime job. We think about it very often as a tour of duty. But while we're on that tour of duty, as technologists, we're thinking about how do we leave behind a playbook, a series of plays that other people can continue to run so they learn from what the mistakes we've made and the lessons we've learned. And so here are some of the digital service plays that they have now put out, and this is the expected checklist whenever building government websites, whenever building government tools, government technology broadly defined. First is to understand what people need. It seems so simple, but very often it's not done. Right? We're not actually doing the quick sprint where you're doing some human-centered design and really asking the clients what they need. Right? Megan talks often about how very often we hear about homeless counts that happen in New York City and other places. And often people are doing that with a clipboard in their hand while they have a cell phone in their pocket. Right? Instead of taking that time real time with GPS and getting the data immediately so that you can know the count now, it's taking months to get those counts in cities around the country back and being far too slow. And part of it is because we're not asking what people need. And by that we mean both the clients and the direct service providers. So if you said to those direct service providers, what would it be to make your job more effective in doing work with the homeless, you might be able to get those answers faster. It includes addressing the whole experience from start to finish, making it simple and intuitive, building the services with agile iterative processes, building the contracts to support fast delivery, assigning one person and holding that one person accountable. So in healthcare.gov, there were lots of people accountable at the beginning. At the end, Todd Park was accountable, the CTO. bringing in experienced teams, choosing modern technology stacks and iterating where you need new stacks, deploying in flexible hosting environments, automating those and testing the deployments. So we launched a website relatively recently and had to make sure that we did A/B testing, that we had our social and behavioral sciences team look at the website and give us feedback on it to make sure that we captured everything we could before launching it in a full-scale environment. Managing security and privacy through reusable processes, data driving our decisions, and then defaulting to open. And so one thing that you can do anytime now in the federal government, the PIF's built a tool called analytics.usa.gov. And on analytics.usa.gov, which you can go to right now there are 136,234 people, Americans, on federal websites. And not only we know who's on, we don't actually know who's on federal websites, excuse me. We know how many people are on federal websites. We know the kinds of things that they are seeing. We can see the top most used federal websites right now. So we can see that people are interested, in April in their tax returns. This is not surprising. You can see the specific sites and then what are people interested in to know. Right now, National Weather Service. Right now it is NOAA, the Department of Agriculture, USA Jobs, the IRS. And so you can actually identify what does the customer want. And you can do that too as nonprofits, is identify simple analytics tools to make them real-time dashboards that you and your team can pull up in the palm of your hand, speaking at a conference and say, this is what's happening in my agency right now. And I can do that for the United States federal government because we brought tech tools in, we brought tech talent in to build these tools that are now experienced. For me, that paradigm shift towards thinking about it happened in Korea. And so I want to talk quickly about South Korea. You didn't expect to come here to hear about South Korea. In 2001, I was following my girlfriend at the time who was on a Fulbright studying in South Korea, and I taught English in a South Korean public school. And I had been taught studying English, and you saw in my bio that I built schools. I was a public school teacher. I built nonprofits focused on education for most of my life. And I was really worried because the United States of America was falling further and further behind. But South Korea was further and further ahead. And this is a country that just 60 years ago was one of the poorest countries in America, in the world. And today was topping even the highest performing American states. So here you have the United States performing in the middle of this graph, and even the best states educationally in the United States of America, Massachusetts, Korea's average student is outperforming Massachusetts. So we are way behind in education, and so we need to change our culture and shift our culture, and that big change is possible. So in the work that we do, I want to think about South Korea. Why South Korea? Because 60 years ago, South Korea was poorer than sub-Saharan Africa. It was war-torn. It was natural resource poor. It was enslaved. They had a system under Japanese imperialism called comfort women, where there was basically human trafficking and sexual slavery across this country. And just 60 years later, in many of our lifetimes, the country is now the country that we think of South Korea, which is Samsung and LG and the highest tech country in the world and some of the best education in the world. So how did they go from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the wealthiest and healthiest countries in the world? Well, they changed their culture. They used culture to drive these tools through democracy, through technology, and through their economy. And so that is the tool that they use. They believed that hard work was success, that they respected great teachers, great social service providers, great nonprofit leaders, that they pushed their clients and their students to achieve at great high education levels, and they combined different elements from the East and the West. And so that's what, in my nonprofit work, I had done. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of those insights in education, and I hope you can apply them to whatever sector you're in, because I think they're relatively applicable. But what happened in American educational culture that led us on that downward trend, that got us behind some of the world, we're now ticking back upwards. We just hit the highest graduation rate we've ever had in American history, but high school graduation rate, but we still are not where we need to be for international competitiveness educationally. And part of that was because our earlier hypothesis is in the law that the president is signing today to change. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 had these 5 hypotheses. We needed to first reduce poverty before we could fix education. We needed more credentials, we needed smaller classes, we needed to spend more money, and that the culture was fixed, we couldn't change it. Schools couldn't change culture. So those are the assumptions that piece of legislation, that paradigm was using. And so the updated hypothesis that I want to present to you today from my work in education, from the president's work overall, and I think in a lot of your works in nonprofits, is that we have to update our hypotheses when they're not working. If we haven't moved the numbers, whether that's in senior services or healthcare or social services for the homeless or whatever you do, we need to update our hypotheses. So one of the things we did was we looked at South Korea for my nonprofits, and we said what they didn't do is focus on the poverty first. They focused first on the rigor, on the expectations. Joel Klein, our former chancellor in New York, used to say, some people think you're never going to fix education until you first fix poverty. I think that you're never going to fix poverty until you first fix education. And that very simple chiasmus, that very simple inversion, makes us realize that we have to focus on raising the bar for our low-income students, many of the clients that you serve, so that they can have that incredible world-class education that they're often denied if they don't go to a great school. That we have to get inspiring talent to work in our school systems, in our nonprofits, that we can't just expect people to do it. We have to make the culture of those institutions places that great people want to come and work. Instead of just thinking about smaller classes, South Korea, my classes in South Korea were 45 students each. I had double the class size in a nation that was spending half as much and yet getting dramatically better results. And so what they were doing was using much more thoughtful data about what each individual kid needed and personalizing that instruction, personalizing the data so that kids got what they needed. Instead of just thinking about it as the cohort and teaching to the middle, we thought about teaching every individual kid over time. We were spending more time in education instead of just more money. And in Korea, they were thinking very consciously that culture is malleable. And this is the thing that I think is the most important of these updated hypotheses. It's great news, because oftentimes when I talk to people about South Korea, they'll say things like, well, yes, but that's just their culture. That's great news, because humans create culture. That's in our power. That's not a law of physics. That's something that we can create, that we can change. And as leaders in nonprofits and leaders in culture, we get to decide what the culture of our organization is and how we lead. And so the fact that culture is malleable means that we can change it and make it what we want to do. But as a tech guy and as a data guy, I wasn't convinced that these updated hypotheses that I was reading about in Korea and watching in Korea were true. So I partnered with a researcher from Harvard, a guy named Roland Fryer, who's a MacArthur Genius Grant winner and the youngest black tenured professor at Harvard ever, an amazing guy. And he started to do some really empirical random control trials on the schools, mine and others, to try to figure out what was really working. And these are the 5 key pillars in nonprofits and certainly in schools that I think you can try to adopt and bring in using tech as the bedrock for making that possible. Inspiring talent, more time, increased rigor, thoughtful data, and joyous culture. And so those are the 5 pieces of the recipe for our success at Democracy Prep and Democracy Builders and Alumni Revolution and these organizations that I've built. But also it's the same pattern of tools that we're using in the federal government. So these lessons are still true. We have inspiring talent at the White House and in the CTO's team. We spend a lot more time on these problems. We are having an increased rigor bar, meaning that our goals and our ambitions are even higher every day. We use data on our daily workflow, and it is fun to work there. And so if you can take these lessons and apply them to your nonprofits, you will be better and stronger and more effective for your organizations. And let me run through quickly some of the data that Roland Fryer found when he tried to examine these hypotheses that I presented to him. He found, in fact, that statistically, through a random control trial, longitudinally, that the impact of reducing class size, per pupil expenditures, teachers with certification, teachers with master's degrees overall, was actually having a negative impact on students. That is totally counterintuitive to what most of us, myself included, believe before getting into this education field. But instead what he found was that giving teacher feedback, data-driven instruction, tutoring, instructional time, high expectations, that those things were having a random controlled trial, longitudinal impact on students with a positive and lasting effect, such that now at Democracy Prep, 90% of our students are persisting in 4-year institutions, despite serving 100% Black and Latino kids, low-income kids from Harlem, the South Bronx, now Camden, and Anacostia in Washington, D.C. And they're doing that because of these updated hypotheses and having tech drive what we do as teachers and leaders. So we're moving from those old insights to the new insights, the 3.0 insights, moving from credentialing to authentic diversity. We need to get much more authentic, diverse talent in the tech sector and the nonprofit sector than we have today. We need to look around our tables and make sure that authentic diversity and the client voices are being heard at our tables all the time. Not just certifications on paper, but actually competent and humble leaders who are there to serve the mission and not themselves. Moving from things like bonuses to competence-based performance steps. When it comes to time, we need to move from founding organizations all the time, and the nonprofit sector has like nonprofit proliferation. You know, it is unbelievable how the nonprofit sector proliferates, but not necessarily always effective. It's really important to get really successful nonprofits to transition effectively, to stay strong, to grow, and each time there's a transition at the leadership level to get even better. To move from things and goals like high school completion to college completion, to move from agricultural time in education and other sectors to technological time, which is all the time. right? We are not working now in a 9-to-5 framework anymore in the way that we operate with technology. And yet most of our institutions, including our work schedules, our service schedules, are very often based on school days that are 9 to 3, 9 to 2, 9 to 5, whatever the model is for your organization. We have to think about time as a totally different thing. A friend of mine often said that we need to make time the variable and outcomes the constant. And in most American organizations and nonprofits, we make time the constant and outcomes the variable. So we have to switch our thinking, switch the culture. We have to move from proficiency to growth as the metric that we're looking for. And in education, this is the most example, right? We can't just look, and the president just did a great address on this with Secretary Duncan. We're not looking for standardized test scores filling out a bubble. We're looking for growth of students over time. And that's a totally different way to think about the work we do. It also means that we're going to incentivize the best talent to work with the kids that have the most potential for growth, the kids who are further at the bottom. So we're flipping the talent pool to work with the kids who need, if we're focused on growth. If we're focused on proficiency alone, then we're incentivizing people to work with the people that are already proficient, that are already doing well. We need to move from static measures to dynamic measures, from bubble tests to adaptive, from cohort-based to personalized instruction, and personalized service provision if you're in a nonprofit. We need to move away from things like the average, right? The average almost always hides really important data. It doesn't tell you about subpopulations within your group of service provision, right? And so you have to think about it in terms of mastery or disaggregated proficiency instead of average proficiency. You know, one of my, the things that I go and visit schools all the time, and the principal very often will say, let me show you my data wall, and it's pieces of paper printed and stuck on a wall, right? So we have to move to things that are much more about machine learning, visualized data, actually moving literally from analog to digital, the ability as a principal, instead of thinking the teacher is going to send a kid down the hall to talk to the principal. Now at our schools and many others, the principal can actually see which classrooms are having behavioral challenges real time, take their iPad and walk down to that room, as opposed to expecting the teacher to send the kid out, lose learning time to send them to the principal. We can think about that same paradigm in whatever nonprofit sector you're in. How do we send our service provision real time to the places they need to be? We need to not just change structures, but change mindsets. We need to move from punitive to purposeful work. We need to think about how do we turn around organizations and schools, and moving to accelerated training, not just remedial. And very often the clients that we serve, the students that we serve, need to catch up. But the way to catch up is not just to remediate. It's actually to accelerate. So my favorite example actually I had up here of that, oops, sorry, we're not done yet. My favorite example here on data is that as a principal, I was going around my high school and I would say, how are you doing in class? And my students would say, I'm doing great, Mr. Andrew. I'm passing all my classes. I'd say, I don't care if you're passing your classes. Like, how are you doing? What's your GPA? And they're like, well, I'm passing all my classes. Isn't that what we're expected to do? And I realized it was our own fault. We told them that passing was 70, and that if you're past the class, you go to the next grade, and like that's the paradigm we set. And so in the middle of the school year, we had the same teachers, therefore, the same principal, the same kids, the same curriculum, the same everything. Between trimester 1 and trimester 2, we raised the passing grade. This was not something that the students were particularly excited about, mind you. We raised the passing grade in the middle of the school year from 70 to 83. The only variable we changed was our expectations of our students. And by changing that expectation, our GPA went up. Our students performed better both on internal metrics and external metrics that second semester and the rest of that year. And it was because we raised our expectations of what was possible. And so I want you to walk away thinking about using technology as a tool then to target what individual kids may need so that you can raise those expectations for them. So now my final thoughts around my personal reform for nonprofits, for schools, for education, is that tech culture will change everything. That tech culture in South Korea, that tech culture that the best nonprofits have, is not about if it's going to happen, it's how soon it's going to happen. And it's our jobs to keep up and to move as fast and try to keep up with the pace of change, because it is mind-blowing how fast things are changing. The unit of change is the client experience. So it doesn't matter what's happening at your home office if that client isn't seeing a difference. So I can have analytics.gov on my phone, but unless the American people are seeing a better website experience, a better government experience, then it doesn't matter. The technology is only a tool. It doesn't change the culture alone. That's up to us as leaders. That's up in our organizations as we work with our clients and our staff to make sure that we can do the kind of work that they need, because they need to not only in our organizations be taught to use those tools of technology, but to actually create them. We launched an initiative at the White House called Tech Hire. Tech Hire is an initiative for under-skilled adults to get rapid accelerated training through things like coding boot camps. And we've heard story after story of dozens, thousands now of dozens of cities and thousands of case studies of people that came in without a high school diploma who are now making 6 figures as a computer scientist. And it seems like, like that's the outlier, but we're now seeing that pattern over and over again, because what we're doing is raising the expectations and giving them the tools through Tech Hire to actually have what they need to apply the tool, to build the tool in the technological world that they didn't have before. So we have to prepare them for that technological culture ahead. And what happens when you do, and this was my sort of moment of culmination for my first cohort of students at Democracy Prep, is that we had them cross the stage at the Apollo for their graduation. And we invited Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, to come and be our graduation speaker at the Apollo. And thankfully he said yes. And when he came and spoke to our students, he told them about when he was in school in South Korea in 1950 under a tree. He had no resources. He had no technology. He had great teachers, great leaders, and he built a culture through his country's incredible hard work from poverty to prosperity, which is what all of us need to continue to build. The president has built that culture with the White House and the work that he's done, and all of you can do that in your organizations so that we can continue to move forward. The president last year, today is part of Computer Science Education Week, and the president last year was the first president ever to write a line of code. And his first line of code, and I'd show you a video, but we don't have time, his first line of code was move forward 100. And he moved the cursor forward 100, and he learned to code taught by an 8th grader from Newark, New Jersey. And so it is up to us to be able to start to build those tools and develop those tools and see the power and potential in all of the clients that you serve and the organizations that you serve, the students that I serve, and now the American people that we serve together, so that they can be the dream that the dreamers dreamed, and because we are the ones that we've been waiting for. So thank you, everyone, for the work that you do. On behalf of the president and Megan, I'm personally grateful. Thank you. And we have time for some questions, and I will do my best to answer the ones that are in my lane. Why don't you start off? Tell us who you are and question.
Hi, I'm Larry Silver with the Stars Foundation. You talked about culture and fixed culture and growth culture, and it sounded like Carol Dweck. So I was just wondering,
Yes.
Is it based on mindset and work with Angela Duckworth and things about grit? Is that some of the motivation for that?
So if you haven't seen the TED Talk by Angela Duckworth, it's worth it. She talks about grit. It's spectacular. Carol Dweck is a researcher at Stanford who wrote about growth mindset. Our schools actually preceded a lot of the sort of popularization of that. So in the beginning, we weren't calling it those things. But the answer is absolutely. Growth mindset is the idea that we can teach our clients, we can teach our students this very, very important notion, which is ingrained, back to the South Korean idea, ingrained in the South Korean educational culture, which is you are not born with intelligence, you develop it, you grow it. That your brain is a muscle that you flex, and the more you flex it, the stronger you get. And this seems so obvious and so intuitive, except that so much of our language in school, so much of our language in social services and nonprofit work is about fixed mindset. It's about saying you are poor, you are low income, right? And we have to think about ways to say, what is the growth mindset we're trying to achieve, about how do we get our students and our clients moving to realize that all of the things that are in front of them, growth mindset and grit, are part of the tools that will help them get out of it. I often say, though, that grit by itself is not enough, right? It requires a culture around them, a supportive culture, organizations, institutions, teachers, social workers, like my mom was for 30 years. I mean, it requires people to help and support and really lift people up to get those opportunities, but making sure that they understand that growth mindset is part of what is most effective at transitioning from poverty to prosperity, from lack of opportunity to opportunity. And so if you haven't read about growth mindset and Angela's work on grit, it's absolutely worth doing. Great question. Thank you. It's like a plant. Yes.
I have a couple of questions, one professional and one personal. So the professional part is, we work with people with disabilities, people living out in the community. Right. So my name's Ravi Dahiya. I work with an organization out in Queens, Bronx. We serve a lot of people with disabilities. They live out in the community, and our mission really is to help people achieve the life they best can. The problem we run into, and since you are sitting at the White House, and maybe you have some influence over this or not, I don't know, because as we talk about all these tools, and we are here, we got a bunch of us here because we want to start talking about technology to a much greater level in our nonprofit. We are 95% funded, 98% funded by Medicaid. And many a time, And you were just using the example of how working with the homeless, you can use some of these smart tools on the ground. As we are talking about people living more independently or controlling their lives, technology becomes a very big part of how they do that because we do it.
Yep.
The people who are making policy do it. They're sitting around with their smartphones, making decisions. They're reminded all the time as to when the next appointment is, when they should be calling their family, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever we bring this up with the policymakers, whether it's at the state or at the Fed, that's CMS, huge bureaucracy, I realize that.
Yep.
Invariably, the question comes down to smartphones, and I don't know why they always talk about Apple phones. I don't know why that's where the conversation goes. Maybe they all have iPhones, I realize, I guess. It's seen as a luxury item.
Right.
People with disabilities, if they have the same or any other population which exists on the periphery and we're trying to bring them into mainstream society, need to have the same ability to use these technologies and be funded because they obviously do not have the ability to get those on their own.
So I can't speak. Go ahead.
So sorry, and the last, I just want to say some of the feedback I get is get those 250-minute phones, which are basically those flip phones, which I don't know who uses anymore. You might as well be using them to bounce across the lake for all I care. Right now, that's what they're using it for. And there's a level of frustration I guess I bring.
Yeah.
So how do you make that change so that people who are on the periphery can be given those tools so that we can provide the right service at the right time with the right intensity, which is the goal of the ACA?
Totally. So it's a great question, and I think it's worth addressing on a couple levels. First, so I was started as a special education teacher, and what made me an effective special education teacher was using technology for my students, because it allowed me to personalize instruction. And this was, in the early 2000s. It allows me to personalize my instruction to individual students' needs. And there's this thing called an IEP if you're in education, but it's very often in traditional public school just a piece of paper that lives every 3 years and maybe gets updated. But technology actually made it real. Technology was the tool that helped actually give the individualized education plans that my students deserved. And so I am passionate about ensuring that kids, especially people with disabilities, have the access to those tools personally. And I think that part of that is changing the culture. So I can't speak to CMS specifically, but I will say that the new normal around what we expect as a necessity to get out of poverty is things like basic technology. And so there's a few initiatives around the country with libraries that are loaning devices to people in the community that are in and out on the educational side, which is really my lane, because I do the educational technology policy work. We've done work on something called Connect Ed, and Connect Ed allowed for both devices and higher speed internet for schools around the country. I mean, it was mind-blowing when I started work at the Department of Education with the secretary, how few schools actually had consistent high-speed Wi-Fi at their schools. Every school had internet, but that's not the same thing as having what we are expecting in a room when we're able to all get on our devices and actually be engaged. And so the last that I would just leave you with is that I think that Megan, the CTO, and all of us on the tech side of the house agree with the basic premise, which is these are tools that we need to empower more Americans with, that a cheap smartphone, not a flip phone, but a cheap smartphone can cost $50 as the hardware, right? So this is not in and of itself a financial barrier. We have to figure out what are the procedural, bureaucratic, and logistic barriers to come at it very often from a different perspective than we might have before. So it might not be on an approved list of eligible devices right now. And what I would ask you to sort of go back, whether to me or to some of the people you work with at CMS, and say, that may be the old approved list of devices, but what do we do to get it updated? At the Department of Ed, we've been updating our regulations and rules to incorporate distance learning, to incorporate personalized learning, to incorporate new tools, because that's the new educational paradigm. A couple more questions. One more, sure. Tells you, no, all right, the president won't be offended, it's fine.
Thank you. My name is Barry Polinsky. I work at the Midwood Development Corporation. It's a small economic development corporation that provides social service and human service to the people of South Brooklyn. My father tells a story about, or he tells an example about, I guess, a contrast between technology and paper. And that if in 1983 you purchased, what at that time was the leading technology, and you wrote a Word document, you wrote a word processor document, there is no piece of technology There's no word processor now that would be able to read that document because technology has advanced much further than that. And it's just not as backward compatible. But if you had a pen and paper document written 500 years ago, you could read it and you could understand it. And what he says when he says this is that technology changes so quickly, and what I do now can be obsoleted in 2 years and 3 years and 5 years. And unless I am leading the charge forward, or unless I'm coming to conferences like this, or very on top of the game, if I invest seriously in technology, I'm in danger of losing my investment in 2 years. But if I invest in that other case of I'm investing in pen and paper, it could still be around possibly 500 years from now. I'm wondering how you respond to this.
So we're not opposed to paper. We support paper and pen in the administration. We use a lot of it, actually. So I think that the argument is good. I think that the reality, though, of your dad's example is that it's outdated, right? Which is that the tools that we're building today for every government record. So every email I write, every government record as part of the Presidential Records Act and other things is archived in the National Archives and will be available forever in the same way that the Constitution is. So although that is a piece of paper at the National Archives, so will my emails be. Now, actually, I don't know if mine will be, but you get the idea. The president's emails will be archived at the National Archives. So the technological tools have got better about solving that other problem, which is being able to read backwards. Like Microsoft Word today can understand Microsoft Word 95, and so it's able to sort of look backwards. And so I think that the broader frame that you're presenting, which is a perfectly good one, is to say there are some fundamental truths, whether that's paper and pen or writing or reading or client services or human interaction, that technology will not replace and should not try to replace. What technology is a tool to help us be better at those things. So Microsoft Word makes me a better writer, right? PowerPoint makes me a better presenter, and I'm not those specifically. So like any company, no endorsement there, like any company's tools are going to make me more productive at the job I'm trying to do. And one of the things that I'm saying with whether that's the homeless example or healthcare example or senior services example, and certainly all of my examples from education, is that what technology does is lets us be more efficient with the resources we have, more effective at targeting the folks we need. And if done well, we can take those lessons from the president's own trajectory, from South Korea, from the work that we've done in the administration to go to take people who don't have healthcare to have healthcare, from poverty to prosperity, from lack of opportunity to the highest high school graduation rate in American history, things that wouldn't have been possible without technology. And so I think this tool is, as you say, accelerating incredibly fast, and it is incumbent upon us then as leaders to stay as much on top of it as we possibly can. So I will end on that note and just say, on behalf of the White House and the Chief Technology Officer, thank you for the work that you do, for the clients that you serve, and continue to do that incredibly good work to advance your missions. Thank you guys so much.